please let me introduce you to our today's speakers. First, you see on the screen Christine Hougaard from South Africa. Christine, can you hear us well?
I can hear you well. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Christine. Good to see you. We have Brett Scott, a financial expert and activist who has also launched a book, Cloud Money. For those of you who don't know it, I can really recommend it. And we have Heike Winter from the Deutsche Bundesbank, the German central bank. You can see the official profiles on the website, but we would like to get to know you a bit better. So please, dear panelists, would you share something with us, something a bit more personal, something which is not written in your CV? Christine, please, go ahead.
Okay, I've got 3 children and a dog, and I'm left-handed. How's that?
What's the name of the dog?
Willem.
Wilhelm, okay. Very nice. Brett, up to you.
I spend most of my time actually playing guitar and music. I was also once struck by lightning and then stung by a scorpion a week later in Zimbabwe.
Wow, we really have to concentrate on today's topic because I mean it would be really nice to hear you play
an interesting story
and learn more about the lightning as well. Heike, please.
Yes, I'm working in the non-cash department of the Bundesbank, but nevertheless, from time to time, I also pay cash.
Okay, very, very nice. Maybe another question, and we will ask you the same question, by the way. Your last purchase, so for instance, when you bought a coffee this morning, or a newspaper, or the ticket for the subway, your last purchase, was it cash or was it digital money? Brett?
Cash. My last 3 purchases, probably, or 4 purchases, all cash.
Heike, your last purchases?
This was the taxi in the morning. I paid with a contactless card, but the tip was cash.
It was cash. And you, Christine?
Card. I don't really remember when last I paid cash.
Okay. We will ask you the same question and can test Votemo. So the first Votemo question, please. Was your last purchase paid with digital money or with cash? So we give you a couple of seconds and then we see the results. Okay, it's going a bit on the one side, on the other. But overall, a very, very clear trend, digital money. Thanks a lot, and we see it's working very nicely. I think that's a very nice bridge to our today's topic, so digital money. Heike, when we talk about digital money, what does it mean? What trends do we see? What are we talking about here in Germany or in Europe?
Yes, we see I think all over Europe, but especially also in Germany, because Germany is known as a quite cash-loving country, more or less. But nevertheless, even here, we see a clear trend to digital money. We have, and that was a little bit boosted by Corona, you can say, or by COVID, because then I think a lot of people learned how to pay with their cashless cards, especially with their contactless cards. That was what I meant, and this is something that has changed. Digital money in general, at the moment, it's commercial bank money. It's not central bank money. It's not like cash. The liability is with the commercial banks, but at the moment we are working on central bank digital money, the digital euro. So this is for the beginning.
We will talk more on that, what that means, a digital euro. So we will learn more from Heike and the other panelists on that, and if it's discuss with you if it's good or not. Christine, you are joining us from South Africa. So what role does digital money play in Africa, South Africa, or in emerging economies in general?
Yeah, thanks, Max. I think we must remember that the context in the developing world, and particularly Africa, where I'm from, is particularly different to that of Europe and the developed world. Yeah, cash is still very much king for most people. And yes, there is a big drive towards digital payments and digitalization, and there's a big policy commitment also for financial inclusion, which is an area that I do a lot of work in. But it's starting off a very low base where the baseline is just for people to have access to an account as a means of transferring money or of receiving money or of making payments. And in Africa and a lot of the rest of the developing world as well, the story of digital money so far has largely also been a story of mobile money. So in some countries, and I think you might be aware of Kenya as being the type of poster child for this, mobile money has really changed the landscape of financial inclusion. And it's really where most people get included for the first time in the financial sector. And it's also a gateway type of product into inclusion for other types of financial services. So without a means of transacting digitally, you can't also access, for example, savings or insurance or credit. So that's where I would say we are at in the developing world.
That's interesting, because I mean, for us here, I imagine all of us sitting in the room, it's so normal to have a bank account. Could you give us an example? What does it mean, financial inclusion? Why does it matter?
I think it matters on a lot of fronts. If your world is entirely in cash and that is your default, it means that you are excluded from any types of transactions within the financial sector. And obviously, we can debate the merits of that. But financial inclusion just basically means that you have the ability to access financial services, which you then can use to meet your underlying financial needs. And with financial needs, I may mean that you want to save up to buy something big, or you want to have insurance so that you can be resilient if there's a financial shock that happens to you, or that you are able to just balance your expenses with your income on a daily basis. So these are all basic, let's say, universal financial needs that people have. And financial inclusion just means that we feel that you have a right to access the financial system to help you meet those needs.
So you mentioned Kenya. One very famous example is M-Pesa, where people can pay with their mobile phones. And when you see it, it really reads like a success story. So millions of users now across Africa, 100,000 of households getting out of poverty because of their mobile phones. How does it work? So you have a family, a mom and pop shop, who usually pay in cash, and now they have M-Pesa. Why does it help them to get out of poverty?
I think it doesn't necessarily help you to get out of poverty. I wouldn't put it that way. But I think we all have the human right to transact as seamlessly and as conveniently as possible. So mobile money often starts out by people wanting to send money home. And over a distance, it's not so easy to send cash over a distance. So in Kenya, for example, when there was a number of years ago when M-Pesa just first started, there was some unrest around an election and people wanted to send money home, and it was just a safer way to do it. Then your next round of evolution of getting into the system is when you then need to say, okay, can I now also transact with this? Is it not just a way of sending and receiving money that I still then cash in or cash out? But does it actually enable me to do my daily transactions, as you say, going to the mom and pop store? And for that to be a reality, you need those stores to have the devices and to adopt also digital payments. So it becomes a matter of building a whole ecosystem within which you can transact. And if that doesn't exist, then cash is just going to be still the most convenient and the most seamless for you.
I think what is interesting in that context is when we use those terms, developing countries or developed countries, it doesn't make any sense at all when we talk about digital money, because, so as we were talking about, the adoption rates are much higher in Africa for mobile money. Also, if you have a look at the users of cryptocurrencies, so the per capita use in Nigeria is much higher than in the US, for instance, so that notion of developed, it doesn't make any sense at all. And nonetheless, it's interesting for us here to hear what you're saying, Christine, because that aspect of sending remittances or opening a bank account for the first time in your life, it is maybe of a different degree of importance here in Germany than in Africa. Brad, you wrote, as said, an entire book on that topic, cloud money. Could you give us a very short overview? What are some of your key points of your book?
Yeah, how to summarize cloud money? Well, at a very broad level, like a meta level, cloud money is basically about the fusion between big finance, by which I mean the banking sector and the big financial institutions, with big tech. All right, and this has been a big story that's been happening over the last decade, where increasingly gigantic digital infrastructures, like Amazon, for example, cannot operate unless they're fused into huge digital finance infrastructures. So at a meta level, if you're looking at the structure of the global economy, that's been the big thing we've been seeing in the last decade at least. So cloud money is looking at that situation, but then also how that translates in the monetary system into an attack on the cash system. At least in places like in Europe, in the UK, in sort of more developed countries. Although I use that term with caution because I have, quite a lot of skepticism about the typical development narratives, because lots of the development narratives often assume that it is naturally preferable to be absorbed into these huge kind of digital infrastructures run by these big corporations. And I think critical development professionals understand that. They understand that inclusion, which often basically means being absorbed into these huge structures, is actually quite a controversial process, and that there's different ideas about what inclusion actually means and how you do it in an empowering way. But at least in the mainstream debate, there's a very particular ideology which says that what progress is basically means being absorbed into these huge infrastructures that are often controlled by, for example, American firms like Visa and MasterCard. All right, and there's a lot of politics to that process. And in that context, the cash system is often being demonized as something that's somehow being stuck in the past, as being out of date, as basically slowing down the acceleration and expansion of the overall capitalist system. All right? There was a point in time, back in the 1800s, for example, where cash was on the leading edge of the economy. It was how you expanded and accelerated things, right? For example, in South Africa, when the arrival of colonialism, colonial officials would go and demand taxation in cash from people as a way to incorporate them into the market economy. So there was a point in time when cash was on the leading edge of the market economy, but in the current phase of global capitalism, it's basically seen as slowing things down. All right, and so this is why there's an ideological push against it, but there's also a structural push against it, where actually the actual cash infrastructure is being attacked in various ways. But we then have a cultural story that says the reason why cash is diminishing is because ordinary people want that. All right, but the reality is far more complex. There's lots of powerful interests who gain often a lot more than ordinary people do from the destruction of the cash infrastructure. And maybe the one metaphor I often use to talk about this, if you want to sort of think about it, is I often talk about cash as being the public bicycle system of payments and the digital systems as being the private Uber of payments. If you are living in an economy where you only have access to bicycles, then sure, it might actually be empowering to have digital systems come into play. But when you have the removal of bicycles, that's a very different situation. You basically have total domination. So a lot of the debate around cash is how do you balance off these interests against each other to create a balanced monetary system rather than fetishizing one or the other. And that's at least one part of what cloud money is about.
Excellent. I think you're opening up an entire universe for us, because when we talk about those big tech firms, Google, Facebook, Amazon, we see a disruption of the economy, a disruption of our societies. I mean, it's almost old school, the term by now, disruption, but we see fundamental changes going on in the way we produce, we consume, we interact. And now, the way you describe, it's merging with a substantial underlying part of our economy, the financial system. So it's really merging. So that's really a tectonic shift taking place, and we should dive deeper into that during that discussion today. Maybe another question to you. We spoke about convenience, a question a bit related to the question before. What do you think? Is digital money more convenient than cash? So if you could go to the next Futemo question, please. So for consumers, digital money is far more convenient than cash. Do you agree? Don't you agree? Or don't you know? That's interesting and probably not astonishing, because all of us know how convenient it is to pay with a swipe. And it brings us back to aspects Brett was mentioning, because a lot of us probably sitting here are wondering about questions like data security, data privacy, also the power, Brett was saying, using that term, the power of big tech companies, of financial sector firms. So what does it make with that power? So we will discuss it further. Maybe Heike, from your perspective, what do you say? What makes digital money so convenient for consumers?
I think it has to do with the technique. With this, for me, this contactless payments is something which is. I can't imagine to pay. Yeah, you can say make it even more invisible. There is this. I think you know about this kind of shops. What Amazon does, where you don't need any cashier, you have registered once, and then you pick things into your bag, and then it will be it will be paid automatically without giving you any notice. Might be behind you will see what this would be even more convenient than you have it at the moment. But on the other hand, I think people would like to control their expenses, and this is a little bit. I think a lot of people, especially in Germany, are a little bit reluctant not to notice how they paid. Yes, but I think this is it. On the other hand, and cash, on the other hand, you can say is also convenient in case you don't want to build up any infrastructure. For these situations, then I think is one of the most convenient ways to, especially also to accept payments. If you have a stand somewhere without much electricity, and so there it works. But this was your question. Yeah. What makes it convenient?
Yeah. So we will see in a second what does it mean for regulators, for governments, for policymakers. Before doing so, let's have a look at us as a consumers. Christine, what would you say? Seeing that we have that big trend towards digital money, what are key concerns for consumers? What is at stake?
So I just need to reiterate again. So I'm speaking from, we shouldn't call it the developing country context. It's not backwards, but I'm speaking from a different context where I think cash is likely to remain relevant for a very long time. So I just want to reiterate that the two instruments will coexist. And I don't think we're talking about the end of cash, like Brett referred to, anytime soon. And what that means is that for most people on the ground, cash is still the default. And we do a lot of consumer research with people. And what we find is that digital money is compared to cash. That's what you see as your default. So if digital is going to compete with cash, it needs to be just as instant and just as seamless and just as reliable as cash. And that's what you're working towards. And it also needs to compare with each other in terms of safety and security. And I think it cuts both ways, because with digital, there's definitely the risk of cybercrime. There's also what is very real on the ground in the African countries that we deal with, this risk of service interruption, of the fact that the network may be down. There might be a network outage at the time that you send your transaction, and then it doesn't complete. So those things are very real that need to be taken into account from the consumer perspective. But then just as much, on the other hand, you also need to understand that in the context where a lot of people operate, cash under the mattress or the cash that you carry in your wallet when you go on public transport can also be stolen. And for a lot of people in the developing world, and I think more broadly, that's still an even greater daily reality than necessarily cybercrime. And then you also need to take into account factors like cost. So often we think that cash is free, and for the consumer on the ground, it is experienced as free unless you get charged to take it out of the ATM. But going and paying in cash at your local corner store is definitely free. But it does come with a lot of cost. And especially, again, I keep on referring to Africa as an example, but did this work in Mozambique, where there's immense costs of transporting cash in transit vehicles, security. There's a lot of cash management and handling fees involved. And ultimately, that gets added to costs elsewhere in the system. So one really also needs to add up, sort of from a consumer point of view, who bears the cost and what is the true cost of cash versus digital. So I think what I want to say is, from a consumer point of view, you can't see one or the other as a panacea. And I really like Brett's metaphor of saying it's like the bicycle versus the Uber. And in a well-functioning system, you really need both to work together.
Okay, thanks, Christine. Maybe we come to the next Votemo question. And maybe on a side note, because we were mentioning the example of M-Pesa, it's not all positive, right? So M-Pesa has earned also criticism. People say, okay, the fees for M-Pesa are much too high. Then we're again in terms of power structure, because M-Pesa has a kind of monopoly in the sector where it is working. So not everything has been positive in that regard. So let's come to our next Votemo question. And it's a question I'm really curious about. Is a crypto millionaire here among the crowd? Are you a crypto millionaire? So the question is it true? So not me, but you. I am a crypto millionaire. Interesting. So also the crypto millionaires or billionaires among you are very much invited to join us later in the discussion. Very nice. So, almost 25% are crypto millionaires. That's impressive. I would like to ask you, Brett, a question on the point you were mentioning, the power structure. You were mentioning the aspect big tech is merging with the financial sector. What are concerns here from your point of view, concerns in that regard, but also what are possibilities for us as consumers when we say, okay, we don't want to give too much power to those big tech firms, to those big banks?
So concerns and possibilities. I mean, the main categories of concern are, there's probably about 5 main categories when it comes to the situation when your entire monetary system becomes essentially dependent upon big finance and big tech. And if you want to put it back in those sort of terms that I was using around Uber versus bicycle, it's like if you imagined a society where the only way you could move was by using Uber, you could work out all the problems immediately, all right? You're deferring a huge amount of power to a single sort of player or a sort of an oligopoly of players. There's huge amounts of data that get extracted. That data has many different uses that could be not only used by governments, but also used by companies in various ways to manipulate you or to give you access or exclude you from things and so on. There's also massive resilience problems. All right. Actually, Christine was mentioning this, where your system goes down and then suddenly your entire economy grinds to a halt. If you're dependent upon digital payments and that infrastructure is weak, you suddenly have serious resilience problems in your economy. There's massive exclusion problems. If you can't use these digital systems, you get excluded. Or if you don't want to use these digital systems, you get excluded. Or if you somehow deliberately get blocked from these digital systems, you can be excluded, which is a very big political tool that can be used, especially in authoritarian countries, to punish people and so on. So yeah, if you think about the sort of Uberification of payments, all these types of problems emerge when you have no alternative. So the real problems with digital payments actually emerge when cash ceases to be an alternative. Because in a way, cash provides this sort of counterpower, as it were. And it's also important to realize, going back to some of the earlier parts of the discussion, Heike was mentioning that we use commercial bank money as digital. If you want to understand what that means, you've got to understand that our monetary system is a composite system. It's made up of different players who issue different types of money. And in many ways, you can think about those units in your bank account as being like digital casino chips. All right, they're actually issued out by the banking sector. And what's referred to as a cashless society is a society where you're essentially using these privately issued or bank-issued money. All right, so you can immediately see that there's a kind of a power shift that immediately happens when you become totally dependent upon that situation. So in terms of then what you sort of do as a public response is you have to basically try to maintain that balance of power between those different forms of money. And that requires, say, policy action. And I know in Germany right now, people don't really think much about this because there's actually still quite a healthy balance of power between the cash system and the digital systems. But if you go to a place like the UK right now, that balance of power has been destroyed. All right, it's almost impossible in certain places to use cash. And then essentially Visa, MasterCard, Barclays Bank, Santander have basically taken over the whole monetary system. All right, so in the places like the UK, it's become very, very acute. And in places like the UK, basically you need to have legislation pushing to have acceptance of cash, access to cash, but also a cultural movement saying it's acceptable to demand a non-corporate form of payment. All right, and it's not shameful, because what these companies have managed to do is to make out that if you're trying to use a different system, you're somehow stuck in the past, there's something shameful about it, you're like behind the curve. So it requires a cultural push to say, actually, it's totally acceptable to demand analog and non-corporate forms of money.
Thanks, Brett. Later on, we will come to another point: is how cash can be used for illicit activities. If some kind of parts of the society would like to use cash to evade paying taxes, finance illicit activities, we will have a look at this later on. Otherwise, I think it's a very nice bridge to the policy aspect. So it's, I mean, we are talking about real gigantic terms, right? I mean, MasterCard, as a traditional finance player, they have over 2 billion users across the globe. Facebook has more than 2.3 billion users. And so, for instance, when Facebook was playing with the idea of launching its own cryptocurrency, called Libra at the time, regulators, central banks were freaking out because they were saying, wow, that company has so much power. What does it mean for our societies? So it's really, really, really interesting. It's a huge trend when those two aspects merge. By the way, people can pay. There is Facebook Pay, and also in countries like Brazil, you can pay with WhatsApp. I think we aren't there here. Before coming to the policy aspect, I would like to ask you a Votemo question, which is of very philosophical nature. Maybe those who are, of you who are older than 40 remember a song by the late Notorious B.I.G., More Money, More Problems. Do you agree or don't you agree? Surprise us. Okay, more money, more problems, not true. And we don't talk about here about the difference between digital money or cash. Heike, so we were talking about those huge trends, about that disruption. How do policymakers respond to that in terms of financial markets regulation, in terms of consumer protection? What are key policy trends that you observe?
Yes, from my perspective, it is, Brett mentioned it's about 10 years, something like that, that we can really say everything is dominated more and more with platforms, those big techs offering. And that came, I think, very fast, and the regulation was not prepared. And now in the European Union, we have realized that and made some very important regulatory pieces to control that. You mentioned the Libra, this Libra project of Facebook, now Meta. Then it was DM, but now it's at the moment it's not on their screen anymore, or not that high on their screen. This was, we had two trends in the EU. On the one hand, there was this MiCA regulation. We have done something that those kind of projects can't happen here without any license, because that was the idea of Libra, to come up with something, a digital form of money issued by Facebook without any license. And that was something which was, yes, you can say, not standable from the regulatory point of view. And there was one regulation on the other hand. On the other hand, the project Digital Euro was triggered by the politicians, but also and taken up by the central banks in the Eurozone. And therefore we have now this project, and this is a little bit also from the perspective that we would like to, we don't want to get too dependent from the infrastructures of companies that are out of Europe. So for this reason, there is this Digital Euro project, which is a huge project which touches really the fundaments of the interplay between banks, commercial banks and central banks. And so it's it's not an easy project, but I think it's worthwhile to engage into that, to come, let's say, in some years to the situation that you have also this official money in a digital form. What now at the moment it's the cash, the official money, you can say. Then we have those private offered digital monies as with cards, or what you do when doing a bank transfer. This is based on the commercial bank liability, and so I think this is to get cash into the digital sphere is something which is necessary, and we are at the moment preparing that.
We'll learn more about that project, because in the first place it sounds probably a bit abstract. Digital money, some call it central bank digital currency, so it sounds very technical. We will hear a bit later why it matters, and probably matters to all of us. I would like to ask you, Brett, two questions. So the first is, we see cash can be used for illicit activities. What is your concern? And also, when we talk about policy regulation, is there a poster child, a country where you say, policymakers, they are really good in that country, or what are challenges ahead of us? Before going into those questions, another question to you. So let's check. Digital finance, does it bring new risks to the economy? So the next Votemo question, please. So, digital finance brings new risks to the economy and the society. What do you think? Wow, that's very, very clear. More than 90% agree. Brett, cash and illicit financial activities and challenges for policymakers and regulators. What's your point of view?
Yeah, this is one of the sort of primary, let's say, attack vectors for people who are anti-cash. the typical way they will attack it is to point out these sort of singular negative elements of cash, like it can be used for crime or tax evasion and this kind of stuff, right? And this is often what gets into the public domain as the sort of the main kind of like, it's a kind of a moral panic in a sense, where there's sort of this sense of like, oh my gosh, there's this criminality. But if you want to sort of analyze this question, there's probably three approaches if you're a pro-cash person. The first is to actually at least partially reject the premise that cash is a criminal thing. The vast majority of people who use cash, and think about, your grandparents or all sorts of people around you who use cash, are not using it for criminal activities. All right? So the first thing to assert is that the vast majority of people who use cash are using it for totally legitimate purposes. Secondly, most of our systems in society have trade-offs built into them. Right? Most things in society have positive and negative aspects, and the mere fact that there's negative uses of certain things does not mean you get rid of these things, all right? And so you're already thinking about it kind of a sort of trade-off approach. It's like, okay, fine, there's a certain degree of criminality that maybe comes with cash, but getting rid of cash brings about a whole bunch of new problems which are often far worse, all right? And Christine was talking about the sort of cost of cash debate. There's a lot of people who talk about the cost of cash, and they say it's costly to provide cash. It's important to think what the costs of not having cash are. All right, the costs of not having cash are very numerous. You have financial stability problems, you've got exclusion problems, you've got resilience problems, you've got centralization of power problems, all sorts of problems that emerge when you don't have cash in society. So you're trying to weigh off these things against each other. And the final thing to say about this is to also think that the proposed solution doesn't actually often solve the problem. Digital systems are extensively used for crime. The entire offshore tax evasion systems and avoidance systems are based on digital money, all right? Many of these systems, cybercrime depends upon digital forms of money, right? So it's not like you somehow solve these problems by getting rid of the cash system. So if you're a policymaker, you've got to be thinking about how do you balance off these different things against each other, if you're too zealous in trying to sort of clamp down on cash, you create far more problems than you solve. And then, so was there the second part of that question?
Second question was in terms of policy and regulation. Do you have, because it's so rapid, that everything that we're observing, are policymakers up to date? Can they respond to those gigantic shifts?
Yeah, maybe it's too big a question because there's so many different responses around the world. But in general, you've got to be aware that, and this may be my bias, in general, we have an ideology in the world that is anti-cash, all right? And this is because we have, in the corporate sector, is highly pro-digital, right? Because the corporate sector loves automation and they love acceleration. So in general, most policymakers tend to be deferring to the corporate sector because most countries don't feel like they have the power to direct the global economy. They often feel they have to actually follow the trends of the global economy rather than leading it. So lots of policymakers feel like they constantly have to be at least partially implicitly anti-cash. I'd say Germany is actually surprisingly strong on taking a sort of quite a pro-cash stance. Probably the Bundesbank can't officially necessarily say it, but in my experience, the Bundesbank is one of the most pro-cash kind of central banks that I've come across. In general, though, a lot of politicians are not prepared to go out with a pro-cash approach. Most of the time, what they will do is say, let's give people more time to adopt digital. All right, that's what they will generally say. Unfortunately, the only politician in the world right now who is going out and taking a pro-cash stance is Giorgia Meloni, and this is coming with a whole kind of sort of right-wing populism element to it, which is very frustrating to me because I actually think this is a cross-political issue. People on the political left should be concerned about corporate takeover of the monetary system, but right now, actually, the populist right is the only sort of political group that's really pushing that line, unfortunately.
That's an interesting point. Already here's the invitation that we will go into a discussion with all of you. So if you have questions in your mind a bit later, you can really type them. We will see also if there's a microphone. Before we go into the discussion with you, maybe a question to you, Christine, with regard to data privacy. So because I mean that's a concern for many of us. So when we talk about digital finance and data privacy, what comes to your mind? How effective are options for consumers? So that would be the question to you. Coming back to the point before regulators. So I think what is interesting is that we are seeing those very rapid dynamics, very huge dynamics, and sometimes when policymakers and regulators are concerned, it's completely new to them as well. So, for instance, an example that comes to my mind is from a bit a different area, but that's when Facebook has acquired WhatsApp in 2014. They paid 18 billion or 19 billion for WhatsApp. WhatsApp at that time had already 500 million users. Facebook had more than 2 billion users. But regulators in that field, normally they have a look when there's a merger and acquisition, but they are triggered by turnover. When one huge company in terms of turnover buys another firm which is big in terms of turnover, they have a look on it and maybe they forbid the acquisition. WhatsApp at that time didn't have any turnover because you didn't have to pay for WhatsApp. So that's only one example where something is really new for policymakers and they don't know how to respond because it's a dynamic that they haven't encountered before. But let's come to data privacy. Christine, your point of view. What are risks? What are options for consumers?
Yeah, I think this is a really contentious topic because with data privacy comes the need for consumers to give consent to share their data. And I think that effective consumer consent requires consumers to be empowered to know what they are actually consenting to. And importantly, also to know what their rights and their responsibilities are. And that in turn requires that they're financially and digitally literate, which in most of the contexts that we work in, you cannot take that for granted. And even for me as a relatively sophisticated consumer, do I always really know what I'm consenting to, or do I just click yes so that I can continue on the website? So I think the way that consent is set up is often just a rubber stamp or opt-out, and I'm not sure how clear consumers really are what they're consenting to and what the risks to data privacy for them personally really are. And also, we were talking just now about illicit activities, but there's also just a lot of informal economic activities, especially in the countries in Africa and in the developing country context where I'm familiar with. So there's also real fear of surveillance of the state and being visible to tax authorities. And with digital comes that, let's say, the option for surveillance. So I think when you're talking about data privacy in the context of consumer protection, there's a lot of consumer education also to be done on the road to what informed consent really means and what you're consenting to. When it comes to the regulator's response to data privacy and data protection, I think in the context where we operate, what we often see is the need for coordination. So you've got different financial regulatory authorities. You've got maybe your Ministry of ICT overseeing data protection, and there's often quite a piecemeal approach and also quite an uncoordinated approach, and it's very difficult for these different entities to speak to each other and also to make sure that ultimately the consumer voice is also heard as part of the debate, and that consumers themselves are represented, and that also you draw on consumer level data and not just on data reported by financial institutions to monitor what is going on and what should be the regulatory response.
Thanks, Christine. So again, a question to all of you. What would you say? Are consumers sufficiently protected against the downsides of digital finance? What do you say? Do you agree? Don't you agree? Oh, again, we have an overwhelming majority this time. You don't agree. You argue that consumers are not sufficiently protected against the downsides. We will come to the open discussion now. So if you have comments, questions to Brett, to Heike, to Christine, please go ahead. We start already. Okay, the first question goes to you, Heike. The last one, M-Pesa. Christine, a question to you. What could be an alternative for M-Pesa in Africa?
I don't necessarily see the need for a big alternative at the moment, as long as it's working for customers. What I think where things are moving is away from mobile money that is operating on USSD. I don't know if USSD is even still a thing in Germany, but it's very much how mobile money is run in Africa. You type *123# and you actually send the signal through, and there's a menu on your phone, and that's not very safe and secure. So there is a movement towards more app-based type of still on the mobile device, financial services, maybe card and tap. There's a movement towards QR codes, but those are still very nascent, and the bulk of mobile money in Africa is still run on this very old technology called USSD.
Okay, thanks, Christine. A question to you, Brett. Let's combine the question of Dan and Laura. Many thanks for your questions. So Dan asked about safety and equity in payments. Laura had a look on which is more expensive and for whom: consumers, banks, state, big corporations. So let's have again a look at that. Brett, what would you say? Again, let's have a look at the role of consumers, banks, states.
I mean, I am not a researcher on the specific costs of cash versus digital in different contexts, because actually there's quite a wide range of different takes on this. It's quite a big debate in the payments world, but which is the most costly form of payments? Is it cash? Is it digital, and for who? So it's quite like a complex area. In my experience, it really depends on who you ask. If you actually go to different shopkeepers and you ask them in different countries, they've got quite wildly different perspectives on this. A lot of them actually bear the costs of digital payments, especially for smaller amounts, right? That actually it eats into their profits. But then they also bear a cost for handling cash, obviously. And different people have different takes on the relative costs of that. In general, in the sort of mainstream debate, the digital payments industry will make out that cash has a higher fixed cost of providing it, right? So it has the actual cash infrastructure, it has a higher cost in general. What I tend to say to that is the fact that actually if you look at a sort of a holistic perspective rather than sort of myopic individual perspectives, you'll see that there are many things in our society that have costs to them, and the reason they have costs is that they are useful to us, right? So the cash system provides the basis of stability for the overall monetary system, so it's right that it actually has a cost, right? It is valuable to us to keep that thing there. A very simple example of this, I was actually recently at a music festival in the UK where lots of the small business owners had decided that they were not going to use cash, all right? So they'd all gone cashless. And then the mobile infrastructure collapsed because too many people were using the mobile systems there, and the entire payment system collapsed, which means that for about whole sections of the day, all the businesses couldn't take any money. All right, so in that context, there was an extremely high cost of using digital payments. Basically, it was almost like 100% cost. They were losing all their money, right? So often the sort of cost of cash, you're going to be thinking about its role in providing resilience to businesses, and especially in sort of developing country contexts or poorer countries, this is a very important part of the cash system. So I'm sort of skirting around this to some extent, but I guess my overarching point is actually there's a wide range of perspectives on what the real cost of this is and what the costs of not having cash are. Sorry if that feels like it's sort of a bit of an evasive, wishy-washy answer.
No, thanks a lot, and I think it's exactly that kind of examples that we need, right, with a music festival, because theoretically it could work for an entire city or for an entire society. So thanks a lot for that, Brett. Maybe to you, Heike, there were questions on the digital euro. Let's come back to that. Could we upload the questions again, please? Okay, so there was a question, the digital euro, what does it really mean? How does it look like? Could you give us a concrete idea? So when there's a digital euro, how do I pay? So normally I pay in cash or with Apple Pay. How would it work with a digital euro?
Yes, I can't give you a very precise answer because we are still working on it. But the idea is that there should be a wallet, which is the normal or the default situation should be there is a wallet which will be offered by your bank, and in this wallet you can store the digital euro, and this will be another kind of money, as I underlined before. This will be the central bank money, which is which has the advantage that yes, the central bank can't get bankrupt, so it's very safe. But for this reason, to be not too much competition for the banks, it will be capped on which amount is open at the moment. 3,000 euros in the Eurozone is one of the ideas, but this is not fixed anywhere, and this should be the idea. But one remark to this festival situation: I'm sure the merchants accepted in this situation also cash. But the problem is that both sides depend on each other. And when you promise at the beginning everything should be cashless, then nobody will have cash. So this is something which makes the market for payments instrument a little bit peculiar. So just one remark to that.
And what in terms of time, when will we be able to pay with the digital euro?
And not before 2027. This is at the moment, we are waiting at the moment for a proposal for a regulation on digital euro that is under preparation at the European Commission. And this is needed because it's a completely new form of money, and there should be some rules how it can be used. And this is, it should come at the end of June, 28th of June we expect it, and this will be, and there is a lot of, this is important because when you think about what is legal tender, this legal tender is something at the moment it's only cash. Legal tender means everyone has to accept this means of payment, and this is something which we would like to have also for a digital euro. And this is something that can be only done by the regulator, by the government.
Brett, of course, I would like to hear what you think of the digital euro. Before that, Heike, maybe we were talking about power shifts, so shift of power from consumers to banks to big tech firms. What would you say, Heike? The digital euro, where will a power shift take place? Is it a power shift towards commercial banks, towards big tech, towards communities, towards the state? What would you argue?
Yeah, it moves a little bit more to official issuing, and this is the central bank, and the central bank does its work because they have they are empowered by the people, democratically, and this is so it's a shift, I think, a little bit away from those international companies. We are here at the moment in a quite, let's say, leading situation.
Okay, thank you, Heike. Could we have a look? Maybe there are some additional questions that came in. Brett, what do you think of that project, a digital euro?
I mean, maybe I would just do it. Maybe it's sort of a help for people who don't know much about sort of politics of money. When you're thinking about monetary systems, you've got to see these like layers. Right, so the primary layer is this sort of state layer, or the sort of, in the case of the Eurozone, the ECB, which sort of issues out this, what for us is actually physical cash is the only form of basically like government money we can use. And then there's a second layer built on top of that, which is the commercial banking layer, which is actually much bigger, right? Partially because what banks are doing is that they have this power to issue out, and I sometimes use this metaphor of digital casino chips. All right, so there's units in your bank account of these bank-issued digital chips, and they have the power to issue out far more of those than they have in reserves. All right, so they actually create large parts of the money supply. And then there's a third layer built on top of that, which is players like PayPal, which plug into the banking sector. And the original debate around cashless society was essentially when you lose access to layer 1 and you become dependent upon layer 2 and 3. all right, the banks and players like PayPal. Now, the new part of this debate is around, say, the digital euro, is when the central bank comes in and says, we're now going to offer a new form of layer one money, all right, in digital form. Now, you can immediately see why the banking sector finds this controversial, because they're like, well, but we're the ones who run the digital infrastructure in layer two. Why are you now competing with us here? All right, so this is why the central banks have to do all this stuff around sort of like making sure the commercial banks don't get too upset by this proposal. And there's a lot of politics around that, and some people would maybe call for a stronger digital euro to compete more strongly with the banking sector. So if you believe the banking sector is too powerful, you might actually want a rebalancing of power back towards the central bank. And many people don't really realize that this battle is going on in the monetary system. So maybe I'll just leave it there. Maybe people can make up their own minds about what they think about that situation.
Good, excellent. I have a look. There are some other topics coming up. So one question is how to counter that right-wing populist pro-cash narrative. So that would be interesting to hear from you, Brett. When people say a right-wing person tells you, "Hey, Brett, you have great arguments. Please come to our conference. You are our guy." What do you respond to those people?
Yeah, this is probably too big a question to do in this amount of time, because there's a huge amount of politics around this. But in general, when you're looking at analyses of power, you can imagine like a pyramid, all right? So picture a pyramid, and in very mainstream circles, and say corporate circles, they'll always pretend that power lies on the bottom. So they'll say, oh, consumers are what cause everything to happen in society. All right. The reason why this is all happening is that ordinary people demand this stuff, and it percolates upwards and informs our decisions. We only act because everyone down at the bottom of the pyramid tells us to. If you have a more conspiratorial mindset, you flip that. You say all the power comes from above. All right, it's being projected down upon people. And historically, there's a distinction between left-wing groups and right-wing groups. So right-wing groups will tend to say it's all about the state projecting power. Left-wing groups will tend to say it's all about corporations projecting power. All right, and there's a whole kind of like amalgamation to some extent between those. What's tended to happen now is that in the post-pandemic world, a lot of the sort of activist energy, as it were, has shifted to the right, who have managed to create this sort of like, almost like a victimhood narrative, which is about all the power is being projected upon us by the state. And actually, there's been quite a sort of amalgamation between parts of the old left wing and forms of this new type of right populism. And so it's all kind of like, in my world, when I'm doing pro-cash stuff, it's actually a cross-political issue. It actually applies to both left and right and all the whole political spectrum. But right now, the debate has been dominated by the right. And the problem is that people on the center left, people on the center left are starting to get put off by that. They say, oh, if I go pro-cash, I'm going to be associated with the Reichsbürger, all these kind of like groups. So what I'm trying to do is to sort of provide this, as it were, like a reasonable argument to say, actually, what the pro-cash movement is about is maintaining this balance of power in society. It's not about saying, you know, like, we believe the banking sector is, you know, controlled by a cabal of elites and so on, which is what the right-wing perspective is. We're saying, actually, a healthy society demands a balance of power between different players, and that's what the pro-cash movement is about. And that's a very reasonable perspective to take, and there's nothing to be ashamed about of that perspective.
May I just add one thing, because we as central banks, we are working on the digital euro, but we are not, we don't want to get rid of cash. So we think, I think I didn't say that before, but this is worth to
remind. Thanks a lot to all of you. Christine, a warm thank you to you in South Africa. Brett, Heike, many thanks. Yes. Please give an applause to our panelists.